Welcome to the monthly webcast presented by Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. We want to begin by thanking Georgia Legal Services for hosting the webcast and making it available on its website. The information provided during this webcast does not constitute specific legal advice and is for informational purposes only. My name is Marquetta Bryan, and I will be talking today about the best practices for conducting employee evaluations. The mission of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta is to maximize the impact of pro bono engagement by connecting a network of attorneys with nonprofits in need of free business legal services. Your slides also contain information about eligibility for services for Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. There's also information on upcoming webcasts and webinars that may be found on the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta webpage. The objectives of the webcast today is that hopefully at the end of the webcast, you will be able to know the benefits of conducting regular employee performance evaluations, the don'ts of conducting employee evaluations, what you should not do, best practices for conducting employee evaluations, and more legally sound evaluations, the impact of employee evaluations in litigation, how to evaluate the problem employee, and what to do when an employee disagrees with your evaluation. If you're not currently conducting evaluations, hopefully this will be information that you can utilize in helping you to achieve the mission of your goals with your organization by using employee evaluations. I'd like to start by just discussing what is an employee evaluation. An employee evaluation, as we will speak of it today, is a formal written assessment of what's good and what's bad about an employee. And not just what's good and what's bad, but an expectation of whether an employee is performing their responsibilities, if the employee is aware of what they are to do in meeting the job standards. It's an opportunity for employers, organizations like yourself and your employees to discuss and communicate what the employee's expectations are for the organization and what the organization's expectations are for the employee. If your organization currently does not have employee evaluations, should your organization start conducting employee evaluations? Many nonprofit organizations are becoming or are more sophisticated as for-profit organizations. However, many nonprofit organizations do not see the benefit or are not conducting regular employee evaluations. However, employee evaluations can be very helpful in general in helping the organization to meet the organization's overall goals and mission. That is important because by virtue of a nonprofit organization, they tend to start with a person's dream and a person's vision. However, as the organization becomes more sophisticated, the one person that started with the dream tends to need other employees to help execute that mission. And at some point, you move from needing employees to execute a mission to having responsible employees that can be effective workers in an organization still moving towards that mission. By having employee evaluations, it is a very objective way for the organization to continue to assess whether the employees that they have in certain positions are the employees that can move the organization continually towards its mission, and whether the employees that you have in certain positions are the right employees with certain skill sets to maintain those positions. There's a quote in your slides. It states, "Quality is impossible if people are afraid to tell the truth." I am sure that most of your organizations are reaching to achieve a certain level of quality as you work towards achieving certain missions and goals. However, achieving that quality also includes a recognition of the truth about your workforce. Do you have the best workforce in place to help you achieve that mission? Some nonprofits, depending on the size of the nonprofit, have less staff. And if you tend to have less staff, you may use employees more and in many different capacities. In that instance, if you are a smaller organization, it becomes more important for you to continually evaluate your employees, to communicate with your employees to make sure that they are not overwhelmed, that they have an understanding of what their job responsibilities are, and that they can appreciate and continue to work towards those standards of the expectations that you have for that employee. Why should you conduct employee evaluations? Employee evaluations first provide a way for managers and supervisors, as I've discussed, to achieve the agency's missions and goals. Employees are in place, again, to perform specific job responsibilities, but all positions that are included within an organization should be working towards an overall mission. Employee evaluations also improve communications between organization supervisors and managers and the employee. Oftentimes, an organization will not have this type of regular feedback with an employee, and there's an assumption that the employee is happy or that the employee knows what they are expected to do, and there's a disconnect between an organization and an employee that can affect the organization reaching its overall mission and goals. An employee evaluation also provides written documentation of an employee's performance. This is important for several reasons. This is particularly important in the litigation context because if you have an employee that may complain or that is a troubled employee, as we will discuss later, or even a good employee, you want to have documentation of that employee's performance because if they should later bring a lawsuit or allege a claim of discrimination or other illegal employment practices, you have written documentation of objective employee evaluations. An employee evaluation should also be conducted because it helps the employee to know clearly what their job duties are and what's expected of them. This is very important, again, as I stated, in smaller organizations where employees tend to perform many different job duties, and you want to ensure that that employee is performing those duties to the best of their abilities and to the best of the organization's expectations.
Question? Can performing employee evaluations harm an organization in any way?
The question that has been presented is, can performing employee evaluations harm an organization in any way? I think that's an excellent question because I think it is an assumption of many organizations that we have been functioning perfectly fine without employee evaluations. We have a small organization, we're very family oriented, we don't have any problem employees. However, as your workforce and your organization grows and you do become more sophisticated in number and in quality of services that you're providing, you will likely increase your employees. I do not think an employee evaluation, if done correctly, can ever harm an organization. However, as we will discuss throughout the webcast, if the employee evaluation is done incorrectly, it can certainly be to the organization's detriment. I'd like to continue to discuss why you should conduct employee evaluations. To continue in that line, employee evaluations also allow managers and supervisors to measure the productivity of their employees. In many ways, whether employees are being productive can be a subjective evaluation. However, it's very important to have an objective evaluation from the employer and the employee's perspective. Many employees would appreciate such objective feedback on whether they are performing their duties well. To receive such feedback will also help to motivate your employees to let them know what they're doing good in the workforce, and will also help them to know what they can improve upon, particularly if they are committed to the mission of the organization. Employee evaluations and communicating with employees will also help employees that may not be as committed to the mission of the organization in having regular conversation about what is expected of them towards that goal. Conducting employee evaluations can also help to encourage employee productivity. Again, employees appreciate knowing whether what they're doing is what's expected of them, and employees typically like to receive positive feedback if that is something that can be given in an employee evaluation. Along that same line, conducting employee evaluations will also increase the employee's development, because if done correctly, an employee evaluation will also help an employee to recognize areas in which they may need training on. It may also help the employer recognize an employee that is fit or poised for growth in the organization, and help them to know how they can move into a higher position if one is available, a management position, or just a different type of position with a different skill set. It helps the employer also be able to recognize what types of skill sets their employees have. Many times nonprofits employ individuals that have many types of skill sets which may be helpful to the organization, but they are holding a position in which only one skill set is being used.
How do you decide what should be included in an employee evaluation? Specifically, what tasks and responsibilities for an employee should be evaluated?
The question that has been posed is, what should be evaluated? What should you evaluate regarding an employee? And that's an excellent question, because that will depend upon the organization, including factors such as its size, its mission, its goals. Particularly, if an organization has certain goals that it wants to reach, you want to evaluate those types of qualities that will allow you to assess whether an employee is effective in assuming certain qualities. For example, there are also different types of criteria that you will evaluate that are germane to all types of organizations. Particularly, for instance, communication. That's a type of criteria that can be used in many types of evaluations. Also, quality of work. So again, in looking at what to evaluate, look at what your organization's goals are and where you want to be in your organization and where you are currently, and how you can assess those types of qualities in an individual that holds certain positions that allows that organization to meet its mission. I'd like to discuss what types of questions employee evaluations should address. You should always address what the employee is expected to accomplish in their position. We've talked somewhat about that. That is important because employees should know in going forward what they are to accomplish to ensure that they are actually accomplishing those goals, and that they are not lost in figuring out what their job duties are. Employee evaluation should also address what tools are necessary to allow an employee to accomplish certain goals that have been set by the organization. Such tools can include whether there is training necessary, whether there are certain supplies and equipment that are necessary, whether there are other people that need to be brought into the organization to help an employee accomplish goals. Employee evaluation should also address what the employee actually did accomplish. This is the only way for the employee to move forward and for the organization to ensure that it has the right person in a position to accomplish certain goals. Employee evaluation should also address what was expected of the employee that the employee did not accomplish. It is very important that not only positive aspects of an employee's position are discussed in an employee evaluation, but also negative aspects. However, there is a way that negative information can be delivered as well. Particularly if an employee did not accomplish certain goals, there is not the conclusion that that is not the best fit employee for the job. However, as the employee evaluation may bring out, that may just be an indication that the employee does not have the necessary tools that it needs. And by conducting the evaluation is the only way that the employee can know what was expected of them, what they did accomplish, and what they did not accomplish, so that in moving forward, that employee can make sure to improve his or her performance. The employee evaluation should also discuss in what areas of improvement the employee needs to improve, in what areas of performance, as we discussed. If there are duties that are essential to an employee's position, it is key that the employer and the agency discuss with that employee that they need to improve upon certain areas if those areas are to remain a part of that employee's job position and expectations. I'd like to discuss preparing to conduct employee evaluations. It may be more important than the employee evaluation itself than preparing the employee evaluation. If an employee evaluation is not done correctly, as I stated earlier, it can be to the detriment of an organization. Thus, there is preparation that is necessary for the manager or supervisor to engage in before they sit with an employee to evaluate that employee's performance. The first step in preparing to conduct an employee's evaluation is to know what the organization's objectives are. Know what the mission is at the time of the employee evaluation. This is important because an agency's mission may have changed from the time that an employee was hired or from the time that the organization came into existence to the time that the employee is being evaluated. By knowing what the organization's mission and goals are, the supervisor or manager or the evaluating employee is more likely to discuss whether an employee is performing their job duties in relation to the mission of the organization, and also is in a better position to convey to the employee what is expected of them in their job duties as it relates to the organization's goals and mission. In preparing to conduct employee evaluations, it is also important to know the employee's major accomplishments for the past period. We'll also discuss what a ratings period is and what is beneficial to an organization and when to conducting employee evaluations. However, it's important to know what an employee's major accomplishments are because that contributes to a complete evaluation. If you're evaluating an employee, knowing their accomplishments and also knowing areas in which they did not perform quite as well as they could have or should have according to the employer, are important in conducting a complete evaluation of the employee. You should also be aware of the employee's development efforts in the past period. For instance, were there areas that the employee did not perform very well and they've taken some steps to improve their performance? If that has occurred, that should be addressed in an overall and complete evaluation of an employee. You should also be aware of the problems with the employee's performance. If you're evaluating an employee that has exhibited some problems in performance and that is not included in the employee's evaluation, as we will discuss later, you could set your organization up for legal claims because you cannot conduct an honest and complete evaluation without evaluating both positive and negative aspects of an employee's performance. You should also be prepared to support negative feedback and positive feedback with documentation if it's relevant or applicable. Documentation, we will discuss, is very important in conducting evaluations. I stated in the beginning of the webcast that if employee evaluations are to be done, they must be done correctly. And documentation is a key part of ensuring that employee evaluations are done correctly. In preparing to conduct the evaluation, you should also determine whether the evaluator can conduct an objective evaluation. In doing this, you might want to consider whether the person that is evaluating a particular employee has a strained or a good relationship with the employee. Have there been any incidences of negativity between the evaluator and the employee? Or are there any other reasons that may negate the evaluator's ability to conduct an objective evaluation? This is very important in assessing whether you might have problems after an evaluation, particularly whether an employee may bring a legal claim based on their evaluation. And finally, you should be clear about whether the employee is being compared to a colleague or against a predetermined standard of evaluation. We talked a little bit, and we'll talk more about what should be included in an evaluation, what the employee should be evaluated on. The employee should know whether they're being compared to another employee or a standard that is applicable to that employee alone. I'd like to now discuss with you types of employee evaluations. If you are already conducting employee evaluations, you're probably using one of these types or another that we will discuss. However, there are many different types of evaluations, and there is no set type that is better for an organization than another. In fact, the type of evaluation that should be conducted should depend on the comfort and ease of the organization, the evaluator, and what type best allows an organization to assess the employee's performance. There are several websites that provide predetermined and preset evaluation forms that can be used and downloaded with assistance, I might add, of legal counsel or other organization consultants to help develop those towards the organization's goals and missions specifically. One type of employee evaluation is a rating scale method. I've included this in your slide because this is a very popular type of evaluation that is used amongst organizations. For example, this particular evaluation may utilize ratings such as unsatisfactory, needs improvement, meets expectations, excellent, and outstanding. Some of the types of performance criteria or categories that may be rated using that scale might include quality of work. Quality of work is a very germane type of category that can be used in any type of organization. Another category might be quantity of work. Depending on the type of job that an employee holds, quantity of work might also be a criteria that is essential to be evaluated for that employee. Teamwork is another criteria that may or may not apply within your organization. There are many nonprofits that engage in activities that require employees to work in teams, and therefore it becomes essential to evaluate whether the employee that you have in place can communicate effectively with other team members and can work in teams well. In using the rating scale method, what you would do is apply one of the ratings that is shown on your slide to quality of work. For instance, if an employee's quality of work is unsatisfactory, that would be the rating given to that particular category. And I would add that written specific feedback is important in explaining why an employee's quality of work is unsatisfactory. And this will be the same in evaluating any type of category of an employee. I have also included on your slide a sample of the essay method of rating employees. There are sample questions that are included, and the essay method is very helpful because the organization can develop questions that are germane to that organization and to that particular employee's job position. For instance, there are questions that you might ask to describe the employee's accomplishments for the review period. And having an employee overall describe their accomplishments or having the evaluator describe the employee's accomplishments, you can include all of the different criteria that are expected for an employee in their particular position, and it does not have to be limited to a particular area or task. Describe the employee's strengths. That's very important in assessing the overall effectiveness of an employee in a position. There's also questions regarding the employee's written work to give specific examples of the employee's strengths. Areas of the employee's weaknesses. Again, these are all questions that will allow the organization and the employee to completely evaluate how effective they are in a position and how they need to improve in a position, if at all.
What if you work in an organization that has a lot of group projects and you're constantly working as a team on various projects so that it's not just an individual completing a specific task? Does it make sense for those team members to evaluate each other? Do they get evaluated as a team? What's the best approach?
That is a very good question, and I will summarize the question that has been posed. In many organizations, teamwork is essential to the organization. And the question that has been asked is whether an employee evaluation can occur as A team approach. For instance, I call that a peer review approach. Can your peers or your colleagues evaluate the employee, and can that be used as an employee assessment? A peer review or a colleague evaluation is a type of evaluation that can be used, particularly if teamwork is essential to the organization and the employee's job duties. However, I will advise and warn that you should not use, or I would not advise that you use team evaluations or peer evaluations alone, and that be the only source of evaluating an employee. I would advise that a team evaluation become a part of a larger organization, a part of the supervisor's organization, and this is for several reasons. Along with the bias that we'll discuss that may come into play just because of human interaction with supervisor employee organizations and evaluations, you also run into problems with peer evaluations. For instance, you may not be able to gauge from an evaluation the relationship that the team members have with one another, and whether there is a positive or a negative relationship amongst those team members that may come forth in the evaluation. For instance, if team members are friends, that evaluation may be more lighthearted than an evaluation from somebody that can remain objective in evaluating a team member. And in that same respect, if an evaluation is from a team member that does not necessarily like the employee that they're evaluating, that may come into play in their evaluation as well and may not be the most honest evaluation. Also, if your organization offers rewards for employee evaluations, team members may be afraid to evaluate another employee as highly as themselves because of the competitive environment. So these are all of the types of things that should be considered when you're using peer evaluations. However, again, I do believe that peer evaluations and colleague evaluations can be a great source of information because there's information gleaned in teamwork that the supervisor cannot gauge in evaluating the employee. I'd like to move on to discuss problems in employee evaluations. We've discussed, and I'll reiterate, that employee evaluations on all respects, I think, are very helpful to the organization. Very helpful to documentation of its history, its employees, its mission, and its improvement going forward. However, if not done correctly, employee evaluations can become useless and can be detrimental to the organization.
If there are only two individuals in the organization, how do you manage bias in the evaluation process?
I think that's an excellent question. The question that has been posed is, if there are only two individuals in an organization, how do you manage bias in the organization process? And in the evaluation process. Again, it is human nature to employ subjectivity and bias in an evaluation. And I think the best way to manage it, particularly with such a small number of employees, is to ensure that the criteria that has been used to evaluate each other or the other employee is the most objective criteria possible. And you can do that by making sure that every evaluation language and category that is being used is backed up by specific examples. For instance, if you are evaluating an employee's attitude, that of course is essential to an organization. However, it can also be a very subjective criteria to evaluate. So specifically, if you're evaluating something that can be very subjective, use specific examples. For instance, you evaluate an employee's attitude by giving examples of how they communicated with the organization's consumers, or how they communicated with the board of directors or visitors to the organization. And by using that, there should be additional discussion between the two employees, particularly the employee and the evaluator, on whether the employee agrees with the evaluation, which is also another method, making sure that the employee has an opportunity to express agreement or disagreement regarding the evaluation to determine that there has not been unfair or unnecessary bias. And finally, I think when you have an organization that is so small, where bias can certainly become a part of an evaluation process, a self-evaluation method may be a very good tool to use in that regard. In that way, using a self-evaluation can help the evaluator and the employee see where they agree or they disagree, and help there to further more communications on how the employee is performing. In discussing problems and employee evaluations, I'd like to start with talking about errors in rating. We talked about the types of rating scale to be used, and I will add that there are no two people that will ever, or it's very rare that employees will be evaluated the same by two people within an organization. Thus, in discussing errors in rating, as I discussed earlier, it is a very good idea and a very good practice to support ratings with written examples of specific instances that support the rating. For instance, if one evaluator evaluates an employee as unsatisfactory in communication and another evaluator evaluates the employee as outstanding, it is okay if you have two different ratings if each evaluator has had different experiences with that employee. And that can be shown and documented well by showing specific examples to support those ratings. Stereotyping and personal bias is also a problem in employee evaluations. We've discussed that people come to organizations and people come in life with experiences and backgrounds and things that influence their interaction with other people and will also influence their evaluations. Thus, you can attempt to avoid stereotyping and bias by again including specific examples that support an employee's evaluation. You do this again by preparing for the evaluation, by knowing the employee's accomplishments, by spending enough time with the individual to be able to accurately and completely evaluate the employee. Failure to communicate standards can also contribute to problems in an employee evaluation. If the employee is taken by surprise on what they are expected to do and what they are being evaluated on, then the evaluation may become useless for the organization and may not present the most accurate evaluation of an employee.
Do I need to wait until a performance evaluation is conducted before I can address negative behaviors or provide feedback when an employee doesn't do a good job at a task?
The question that has been posed is, do you have to wait to advise an employee on what they may have done bad or not done so well in their employment? Do you have to wait for the evaluation to occur for that conversation to take place? The answer to that is absolutely not. In fact, it is not a good practice to save conversations with employees about things that may not have been done well or examples of times where the employee may have messed up on a project or not has done as well as they should have for an employee evaluation. The reason for that is depending on the time that can lapse and occur, and depending on the outcome of the employee evaluation, the organization may want to take disciplinary action against an employee. The organization may decide that the employee should be terminated. And by waiting to discuss certain behaviors at the employee evaluation, the employer sets itself up for particularly maybe a frivolous lawsuit or a disgruntled employee or having to fight off a frivolous claim. You should always discuss good and bad things with an employee as they occur, and then the employee will not be taken by surprise at the evaluation, and the evaluation becomes another useful tool for addressing further the negative behaviors that have already been discussed with the employee. Which brings me directly into my next point of problems with employee evaluations: failure to give timely feedback. As I've just discussed, do not wait until an employee evaluation to give timely feedback, that is positive feedback or negative feedback. Failure to allow employees to correct performance. If you have given an employee timely feedback and they're aware of what the employer perceives to be problems in their employment, the employee should have an opportunity to address and correct those issues if they are in fact valid objective issues. Inconsistency in measuring performance. We discussed earlier that the employee and the employer should be aware of whether the employee is being evaluated compared to colleagues or against a standard that applies to his or her job responsibilities alone. An employer is inconsistent when they Determine an evaluation rating based on something that has not been discussed with the employee, or they apply inconsistent or different criteria to different types of employees. Failure to document performance subjectively. We will discuss at length later in the webcast about why documentation is important. Documentation is important for the organization's history, and documentation is also important in ensuring that the employee has a record of evidence should it become necessary if an employee is unhappy with their job, or if the employer has to terminate an employee and an employee brings litigation based on the employee's evaluation.
How often should employee evaluations be conducted?
The question that is posed is, how often should employee evaluations be conducted? Typically, employee evaluations are conducted on an annual or a yearly basis as set by the employer. However, in larger organizations, sometimes employee evaluations are conducted on a semi-annual basis. This can be determined by the agency in determining what is necessary for that organization and the size of its workforce. That can also be determined based upon factors such as, what is the employee turnaround in your agency? Do you have an agency where employees stay a longer period, or is there a short-term duration of employment within your agency? If you have high turnaround with employees, you may want to consider conducting a more formal evaluation on an annual basis, and maybe a less formal, although still written, evaluation on a semi-annual basis, to ensure that you are constantly evaluating that you have the right employees in the right positions. In discussing problems with employee evaluations, I would like to highlight discrimination in employee evaluations. There are many different areas of discrimination that employees can raise as a process or as a point in employee evaluations. For instance, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prevents an employer from discriminating against an employee on the basis of a protected characteristic that includes race, gender, religion, national origin, ethnicity. Such factors should never become a part of an employee's evaluation. And so in general, the employer should only evaluate the behaviors and characteristics that are a part of and are necessary for that employee to perform in that job capacity. Accordingly, employee evaluations should never be based on and should never include language that appear to be based on an employee's race, sex, gender, or any other protected characteristic.
What about comparing employees in the evaluation process? Is that okay?
The question is whether comparing employees in the evaluation process is okay in conducting evaluations. And comparing employees can present problems for an organization, particularly in terms of how that comparison is done and how that's communicated to an employee. I believe first and foremost that I should say it is inherent, I think, in an evaluator's subjective process that they may tend to compare employees, because you may have employees that work in the same position. One employee may perform better than another one in terms of the evaluator's opinion. However, understand that when you compare employees, even if you're comparing them based on their job duties and how they perform only those job duties, an employee may perceive that they are being compared based on some protected characteristic that is prohibited under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act or other discrimination or employee laws. So the best practice is to not compare employees, but to evaluate the individual based on their performance in their position and based on what that employee should be doing. For instance, if you have two employees that are performing the same job, if you expect one employee to perform that position better than another employee, base that on that employee's experience, their length of time in the job, what that employee has accomplished over time, and how they have attempted to improve their performance. And looking at another employee that may have less experience, rate that employee based on their level of experience. For instance, If one employee has only 1 year of experience and one employee has 4 years of experience, do not rate the employee that has 1 year of experience against the employee that has 4 years of experience, but rate the employee based on how they should be performing with that 1 year of experience and how the other employee should be performing based on having 4 years of experience.
Can physical characteristics such as obesity that are not a disability per se be considered in evaluations, and should they?
The question is, can physical characteristics that are not considered protected characteristics per se, such as obesity, be considered and contemplated in employee evaluations? If obesity or any other characteristic that is not protected or is not a disability is a part of a job position, you can evaluate. However, that's with a caveat. Terms that will indicate to an employee that they're being evaluated on a characteristic other than their performance of a job can always cause problems. That is a caveat there. However, if an employee's job duties require them to lift certain weight or to move around or to be more active, I would advise against using words such as obesity and use more objective language such as the employee's quality of performance is not up to the standards because of an example where they did not exhibit a certain amount of energy in performing something or lifting the amount of weight or whatever the obesity or the characteristic is affecting them. The characteristic in which you are evaluating should contribute to the employee's ability to perform in their job duties. If the physical characteristic or non-disability does not affect an employee's ability to perform their job duties, then I would advise that it may not have a place in the evaluation. I would also add that, particularly due to the question of obesity, even if obesity itself is not considered in general, specifically in a law, to be a disability, you should always be aware that under the American with Disabilities Act, there is a claim of regarding or perceiving an employee as disabled. And there are many types of conditions under the Americans with Disabilities Act that can be defined as a disability that may include such characteristics as obesity. Depending on how that is evaluated with an employee, that employee may perceive that they are being evaluated on a protected characteristic disability due to the fact that the employer perceives them as being disabled because obesity or whatever the other physical characteristic is not related to their performance of job duties. For instance, if you have a front office person that meets with consumers, are you concerned that this particular characteristic prevents the employee from meeting their responsibilities under their position goals or characteristics? Or are you concerned about the perception that that characteristic is bringing to the organization? If you are concerned about the latter, then you may have a problem, or you may have negative feedback from an employee in agreeing with that type of evaluation characteristic. I'd like to move on to discussing best practices for conducting employee evaluations. This relates very well to the last question that was asked. Develop an evaluation form that relates to the employee's job. To avoid evaluating employees on characteristics and measures that are unrelated to the employee's job, it is important that the evaluator determine what is necessary to the employee's job. What is important to be evaluated for this particular employee? And that will differ based on what role the employee holds within an organization. Again, it is not rare in a smaller organization where many employees wear different hats. And in that aspect, you may determine the type of evaluation model that you will use. In that situation, you may use the essay model, and you do not limit yourself to attempting to figure out ratings or specific criteria for an employee that wears many different hats in the organization, and you can assess the employee's overall effectiveness as an employee. Complete evaluations on a regular basis for employees. When employers decline to complete evaluations on a regular basis, we discussed an annual basis or a semi-annual basis, it may appear that the employer is not interested in the employee's development, and it may also appear that the agency is not interested in whether the employee is contributing to the organization's goals. Again, the employee also typically appreciates the feedback that is received during employee evaluations because that gives them an assessment of where they're going with the organization, where they have, if they have a future with the organization, and whether they are performing their duties as expected.
Are there any words or phrases that should not be used when documenting employee evaluations?
The question is whether there are any words or phrases that should not be used in conducting employee evaluations. And that brings me directly to the next point that I'd like to cover as a best practice, which is avoiding the use of subjective criteria and vague criteria in words and phrases in employee evaluations. Always use objective criteria and descriptive criteria if possible. Subjective and vague criteria can set the employer up for a legal claim. Subjective and vague criteria does not give the employee first and foremost an idea of why their performance meets or does not meet certain goals of the organization. That is important, particularly in the litigation context, because if you have an employee that challenges his or her evaluation, that employee will likely look to his evaluation and the evaluation of a similarly situated co-employee. For instance, if you have an evaluation that subjectively or vaguely states this employee is outstanding without any type of description, or on the converse, an evaluation that states that an employee is unsatisfactory or has not met the goals without any type of description, the organization does not have a method of proving that it has conducted an honest evaluation. The employee also may have a different perception of their performance, and the evaluation cannot be used as the adequate documentation to dispute or to affirm what the employee is stating is their true performance. So never use subjective criteria if possible, and there are ways that subjective words can be turned objective. For instance, if you'd like to state, or if you find yourself stating an employee has a bad attitude, that employee may believe or perceive that that is just one evaluator's perspective, and that is not a true perception of the employee's attitude. By using descriptive language and objective language, the evaluator can best state something, for instance, like the employee did A, B, or C, or did not exhibit the best attitude when dealing with a member of their team on a particular project. And so there are many ways that subjective language can be transformed into objective language just by using descriptions. The next point that I'd like to cover is to train managers and supervisors on how to conduct employee evaluations. We discussed earlier in the webcast that preparation is key. When you have an evaluator that goes in to conduct an employee evaluation, that evaluator should know what to do and what not to do. As we discussed, the problems and performance evaluations: avoid subjective language, avoid vague criteria, avoid subjective bias, avoid personal opinions in employee evaluations. These are things that must be covered, and the training of management that are conducting the evaluations is often more important than conducting the evaluation, because the two really go hand in hand. If you have somebody conducting an evaluation that is not trained to conduct that evaluation, you will set yourself up for a detrimental piece of documentation or evidence should you have litigation over an employee's evaluation. The next statement, or the next practice to adhere to, is to always conduct evaluations in writing. Never allow formal evaluations to be done verbally, simply because there is no record of a verbal evaluation. By having a writing, and if the evaluation is done correctly and honestly, the employer has essential documentation that can be used in the course of litigation challenges on an employee's evaluation. In continuing with the best practices for conducting employee evaluations, complement good performance. Employee evaluations, while appreciated by employees, may also be a source of dread for employees as well. Employee evaluations are not 100% about highlighting an employee's negative performance and also can contribute to a decrease in morale in an employee workforce. Therefore, ensure that you complement good performance in an evaluation, which can often contribute to the employee's commitment and continued commitment to achieving the organization's missions through good performance in their employment. Identify and address problem performance. Employee evaluations should never include all flattering statements if that is not the case with an employee. If there is any issue that should be addressed, with an employee, it must be included in that performance evaluation. There is a ton of case law that talks about, and court opinions that talks about challenges to an employee's evaluation wherein the evaluation did not comport with the supervisor's statements about an employee's problems. For instance, courts have looked at evaluations that have all flattering comments about employees and a supervisor's statement that an employee was a troubled employee to state that the employer did not conduct an honest evaluation or the employee failed to document the employee evaluation, and therefore the organization was either liable for discrimination or the employer or the organization had to spend the resources to have a trial of certain litigation because of the disagreement in the written evaluation and a supervisor's statements about an employee. I create new performance goals. If there's anything that should be addressed with an employee, make sure that that is listed in an employee's evaluation going forward so that an employee knows what they have to work to in an organization. Include observations, not assumptions. Again, using descriptive, objective language is an example of using an observation, not an assumption. Do not assume and don't state in an employee's evaluation that an employee does not like their job. If you don't think an employee does not like their job or is not the best fit for a job, and particularly if you're using an evaluation as documentation to take significant personnel action such as terminating an employee or demoting an employee or transferring an employee to another position, you want to make sure that you include observations of why a rating is given and not an assumption. Be brief but complete. I state to be brief because you can be complete with brevity. However, written evaluations do not require excessive writings, and watching what you write can also protect you in the course of litigation. For instance, if a supervisor writes the objective and descriptive language that is necessary, it is highly unlikely that they will need to add additional information in setting forth the specific criteria for an employee's evaluation. So I state that it is always important to be brief but complete. If the employee would like follow-up, or if the employee would like to add something to their own evaluation, allow that to be the extra writing that occurs in an evaluation. We've discussed avoiding bias in employee evaluations. Really important as a best practice is giving the employee the opportunity to review the evaluation and comment in writing. There are times when an employee will agree with their evaluation, and there are also times when an employee will not agree with their evaluation. By giving the employee an opportunity to review the evaluation and to comment in writing, saves the employer from a frivolous legal challenge to an evaluation because the employee is not surprised. They have seen the evaluation, they have had an opportunity to comment and to engage in discourse about the evaluation, which is also in line with following up with the employee regarding any reports of illegal discrimination or treatment in an evaluation that the employee brings out in the employee evaluation. For instance, an employee may state that they've been discriminated against, and that's why their performance is not as the employer expects. Or the employee may state that they've been harassed, and that has contributed to a negative performance. It is essential that you follow up with an employee and investigate any such claims that are brought about or are made light during an employee evaluation.
Do you have to give a copy of the evaluation to the employee?
The question is, do you have to give an employee a copy of their evaluation? While there are no laws in Georgia that require an employee, a private sector employee, to have a copy of any type of personnel documents or an evaluation, I suggest that it is a good practice that the employee have a copy of exactly what the employer has. Particularly in the face of a subsequent legal challenge, the employee has had an opportunity to comment and has a copy and has shown that they've had an opportunity to review it, to disagree or agree in writing, and that is the complete and extent of the evaluation. So I suggest giving the employee a copy. Document the performance of all employees, not just bad employees and not simply good employees. By documenting the performance of all employees in the face of a legal challenge to an employee evaluation, the employer has documentation to support significant personnel decisions that it's made with good employees and significant decisions that it's made with bad employees. Provide complete and accurate information. We discussed that concept throughout the webcast, that it is important that employee evaluations are complete and honest and contain information about an employee's good accomplishments as well as any negative accomplishments throughout the year. Document performance on a regular basis. We've discussed talking to an employee consistently throughout the performance year and not waiting to an employment evaluation to discuss such things with an employee. Documenting on a regular basis also contributes to the preparation necessary in conducting an employee evaluation. An employee will likely ask for examples and documentation of negative ratings and feedback. By keeping documentation of good and bad performance throughout the year, the employer is in a better position to support an employee's evaluation and rating. Make sure that the documentation is objective. Objectivity is a continued theme in conducting employee evaluations, so you want to make sure to avoid subjective evaluations. In conducting employee evaluations, avoid lightheartedness. For instance, avoid forgetting to conduct evaluations and do not conduct evaluations lightly. As we discussed, employee evaluations should be complete, and if they are not complete, the employee may feel that the employer is not taking the employee's work or the organization's goals seriously. Avoid surprises. Again, that goes to documenting and discussing with the employee throughout their performance period of what their performance is and not waiting into an evaluation. Lack of preparation. Ensure that the evaluator is prepared. Insensitivity should also be avoided. As we discussed, employees can perceive that they've been discriminated against or treated illegally if an employer appears insensitive. For instance, if you discuss an employee's obesity or other characteristic that is not necessarily prohibited under the laws, but however, can allow an employee to perceive that they are being rated on something that is not related to their job, you are necessarily setting yourself up for a legal claim from that employee. We've discussed avoiding discrimination and harassment by making sure that the employee is evaluated on true and objective criteria that is related to their performance. And also what we have not discussed, but I will add, is avoid retaliation in employee evaluations. Particularly if you have an employee that has engaged in conduct. For instance, if an employee has reported discrimination, has reported harassment, make sure that your evaluators are not using an employee's evaluation as a tool to harass them or retaliated against them for engaging in conduct where they've reported discrimination or harassment. There is an example in your slides on what not to say when evaluating employees. And I will not go over this with you, but there is a discourse between a supervisor and an employee that highlights some of the things that we've discussed throughout the webcast of what should not be done. I hope you take the time to read that example, but what happens in that scenario is that the supervisor compared the employee's performance to that of a coworker. We've discussed the problems with doing that. The supervisor made the employee's evaluation personal. Again, stick to objective and descriptive criteria and avoid assumptions. The supervisor was vague and nonspecific. If an evaluation, as courts have shown, are vague and nonspecific, the courts cannot rely upon an employer's explanation for why they took a significant negative or adverse personnel action with an employee. And finally, we'd like to sum the webcast by going over how to avoid legal problems when conducting employee evaluations. Counsel your supervisory employees to create a thorough and accurate record of employee performance. As we have discussed, and I will state again, courts have been hard on employers where they have not documented accurately an employee performance and later seek to raise in a litigation context that an employee was in fact a troubled employee. For instance, if you have an employee of 10 years that has received all good evaluations and the employee is terminated for being a problem employee, you will likely have a problem litigation claim, depending on the type of claim that has been brought by the employee. Be candid in assessing both strengths and weaknesses. While it is sometimes human nature to either follow to one extreme or the other, do not be over-flattering in an employee evaluation and do not be over-critical in an evaluation. This is not only important from a litigation context, but this is also important in making sure that you are increasing your employee productivity and morale. Document and relay to the employee failure to meet legitimate requirements. Do not allow negative performance behaviors to go unchecked in an employee's performance. The evaluation time and throughout the year is the best place to address those behaviors. Utilize witnesses for evaluations. This is particularly important if you're dealing with a problem employee. If you believe that you might have a challenge to an evaluation based on past performance or relationship with an employee, make sure that there is more than one person in the room conducting an evaluation. Make sure your evaluations are consistent. Make sure that if employees should be evaluated on the same criteria, that they are evaluated on the same criteria and that one employee is not judged more harshly than another because of employer bias. Follow a discipline policy if it's applicable. For instance, if you have a handbook and you have a discipline policy that requires that certain discipline be taken after an employee evaluation because of negative performance, make sure that you follow that policy. Remember that no good deed goes unpunished. I'd like to reiterate that an employee evaluation should not be over-flattering, because if you do have a performance problem with an employee and you have an evaluation that is completely positive, that you will face that when you decide to or have to take a more realistic personnel decision with respect to a problem employee that has received good evaluations throughout their performance period. We've discussed using specific evaluation criteria in the form of examples and observations. And if we have time for more questions, thank you very much.